Good morning, afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you and yours are safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome to the program Dr. Khalil Shikaki, a preeminent Palestinian pollster and analyst of Palestinian and Israeli politics. I've known Khalil since the early 80s. He is an individual of enormous integrity and honesty. He deserves no introduction. He actually deserves an introduction, doesn't need one. Let me just briefly say he's a professor of political science and director of the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, Ramallah, Palestine. Since 2005, he's been a senior fellow at the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis. He finished his PhD in political science from Columbia in 1985 and has taught at several Palestinian American universities. Between 1996 and 1999, Dr. Shikaki served as the Dean of Scientific Research at Al-Najah University in Nablus. Spent the summer of 2002 as a visiting fellow in Brookings. He has conducted more than 200 polls among Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And since 2000, dozens of joint polls among Israelis and Palestinians. So, Khalil, Dr. Shikaki, I want to welcome you, warm welcome to Carnegie Connects. Before we begin,
thank you, a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Before we begin the conversation, I want to make I guess it's a personal comment about what we watched over the last several weeks and what we're likely to see going forward. I've devoted most of my professional life trying to help resolve the Arab-Israeli, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I've experienced and witnessed two intifadas, at least four Israeli-Lebanese conflicts that involve Palestinians, and numerous and daily conflicts and confrontations in this sort of perverse dance that occurs between the occupier and the occupied. And I must say that what we're experiencing now really has no precedent. I fear, and this is my fear, that we're going to be left with two traumatized societies without the leadership to try to find a better pathway forward. And I hope I'm wrong. What gives me hope, however, is that it's hard to see, frankly, and nor can we actually predict what's in front of us. I was in Jerusalem on October 6, 1973. I watched Israeli society traumatized by particularly by the Egyptian attack in Sinai and Syria on the Golan Heights. And yet within 6 years, by 1979, Egypt and Israel had concluded a full treaty of peace. 20 years later, their trauma turned to hope. 20 years later, I sat on the White House lawn watching somewhat in disbelief as Arafat, Clinton, and Rabin signed the Oslo Accords, thinking in one of the most galactic misjudgments of my career that Israeli-Palestinian peace was only a matter of time. And yet their great hopes turned to trauma. So trauma to hope, hope to trauma. I think what it suggests, frankly, is the arc of history bends in ways that are strange and frankly unpredictable. And we can hope all we want that it'll bend in a way that would create a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. But unless humans tirelessly work at this issue, that bend of the arc of history is not going to bend in the right way. I say this knowing full well that we're in a long, dark tunnel. What's going to emerge at the end of it is far from clear. So Khalil, let me start the conversation by asking you. You've watched the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You've lived it. Give us a sense, if you can, of the historical trajectory with respect to this conflict. What's unique about it, and what is familiar and reminds you of the past?
Well, the last 30 years have certainly seen a lot of change, ups and downs. This is one of those moments in which things have been seen as totally hopeless by both sides. The belief among Palestinians and Israeli Jews has been that they have no partner for peace. Two leaderships that have shown lack of imagination, wisdom, and leadership to move forward with regard to peace. The period, however, did have a lot of hopes, and your hopes in 1993, I think, were not completely unwarranted. I think we have seen a lot of progress. The fact that we have managed, the two sides have managed to come to terms with some of the most difficult issues and to come around the two-state solution and to try to resolve the basic differences, both sides accepting very, very painful concessions, I think indicate that it is possible to eventually come to an agreement. One can focus on the shortcomings and the failures, but I think one can also focus on what has been doable, or how much we have achieved, how close we have come in the past to reaching an agreement. And that if one is to focus on that, one can certainly have hope with the right leadership, not just local Israel-Palestine, but also with the right leadership from the region and from the international community and the US. One can see the issues that have so far been extremely difficult to resolve being resolved. The bloodshed that we have seen in the last 3 weeks have certainly been unprecedented. There is absolutely no doubt that the magnitude of the Israeli and the Palestinian casualties has been unprecedented. Not even in 1948 did we see this magnitude that we currently see and will continue to see in the upcoming weeks. And on top of that, the magnitude of civilians being involved in the killing on both sides, on the Israeli and the Palestinian side, is also unprecedented in any other Palestinian-Israeli conflict that we have seen so far. Similarly, if we look at how successful Hamas's offensive has been, one can't find another Palestinian example in the conflict since 1948 and even before, in which a Palestinian organization can claim to have inflicted this kind of pain and suffering on the other side, and to succeed in the kind of preparation, surprise, operational performance. There is absolutely no doubt that Palestinians and Israelis will see this as a great success for this organization. Yes, they will also, of course, see all the atrocities that have been committed. Both sides will justify what is currently being done. Both sides will view this as a response to what the other side has done, and will focus on their own suffering rather than on the suffering of the other side. And there's nothing new in that. In all the confrontations, civilians have been the greatest victim of all of this. And the belief that we are doing to them what they are doing to us will keep justifying in the minds of the majority of Palestinians and Israelis the justification for the atrocities. There will be a lot of people, of course, who will remain in denial. I say this again for both sides. The suffering on the Palestinian side as well as on the Israeli side has been tremendous during these weeks, and there will be a lot of people who will remain in denial. And once the facts are really known, there will be a lot of reckoning and a lot of accountability.
Yeah.
But we're not there yet. The international reaction, by the way, has also been unprecedented, particularly to what is going on right now with the Israeli targeting of civilians. There are things, however, that are not unique. This is a case where Hamas has been leading the Palestinians, unlike the Palestinian Authority, which has been totally absent. It remains to be seen, obviously, what will be the domestic impact in both Israel and Palestine in the aftermath of this. And these, the domestic impact could, of course, be great on both sides. It could be a turning point for the two societies.
There's going to be a reckoning on both sides, no doubt. I want to get to the issue of Palestinian support for Hamas. You've done numerous polls. One that was done, and I think you participated with the Arab Barometer, which was done between September 28 and October 8. They surveyed 790 respondents in the West Bank and 399 in Gaza. The conclusions were fascinating. Asked to identify the amount of trust they had in the Hamas authorities, a plurality of respondents, 44%, said they had no trust at all or not a lot of trust, was the second most common response at 23%. Only 29% of the Gazans interviewed, admittedly a small sample, expressed either a great deal or quite a lot of trust in their government, meaning the Hamas government. And what I found particularly interesting, when asked how they would vote in a presidential election, if it were held in Gaza, and the ballot featured Ismail Haniyeh, leader of Hamas, Mahmoud Abbas, president of the PA, and Marwan Barghouti, now serving 5 lifetime sentences in an Israeli prison, 12% for Abbas, 24% for Haniyeh, and 32% for Barghouti. So we can talk about, you don't have polling results, obviously, over the last several weeks, but try to unpack what is the nature and basis, in your judgment, of Hamas's support in Gaza? What drives it?
Most Gazans do not support Hamas, as you have just said. This has been the case just before the start of the war. And the survey that we have done jointly with the Arab Barometer and the surveys that we have done in the months just before that, the latest was in September, just a month before the war, do indicate very clearly that support for Hamas was on the decline. In fact, just 4 months before the war started, there were demonstrations led by young Palestinians in Gaza complaining of Hamas, the difficult conditions that Hamas has imposed on Gaza. So there is no doubt that things were extremely difficult for Hamas in Gaza in terms of its popularity, in terms of its the performance, not just with regard to service delivery, but also in terms of the nature of the political system and the lack of future for Gazans as perceived by Gazans. But support in Gaza for Hamas is greater than it is in the West Bank. In the survey we did in September, only 12% in the West Bank said Hamas is the political party that they favor the most, while in Gaza it was 38%. That's not a small 38. But the main reason for that is to do with people sharing Hamas's value system when it comes to religiosity, the belief that Islam is a religion and a government simultaneously, the identity of Gazans who tend to, of many Gazans who tend to, more than in the West Bank, who tend to view their religious identity as important or more important than their national identity. So these are values that many Gazans have shared with Hamas, but Hamas has been in the past also seen as incorruptible, as one that was combating corruption. Hamas in the past have also seen as more efficient in delivering services, including law enforcement. And Hamas, most importantly, during years of tension and war with Israel, was seen as the one that has the capacity to inflict pain and suffering on the Israelis, thereby having leverage, forcing Israel to make concessions, while the Palestinian Authority lacked that leverage and therefore was unable to make progress through diplomacy and negotiations. These are some of the assets that Hamas had in the past, although, of course, as we come close to 23, Hamas failures also become very evident for the large majority of Palestinians in the West Bank as well as in Gaza.
Right. If you were to poll now what do you think the popularity of Hamas would be in two respects? One, the brutality and savagery of what the pain they inflicted on the Israelis in the first 24 hours of October 7, on one hand, and as Israel's efforts to strike Hamas in Gaza and the deaths and destruction that has resulted. How do you think these two factors, the ebb and flow, would come out in polling now?
On the atrocities committed, the attacks on civilians, the taking of hostages, most Palestinians at this point are in denial. And we're not yet going to be able to see the impact of that once Palestinians begin to look into this and see the reality. What they will say is Hamas's victory. Hamas is standing up to Israel. Gazans certainly under severe conditions right now, and I'm not going to say how they feel. I have no idea how they feel. I have family in Gaza, and I talk to them all the time. And I can tell you the pain and suffering there is tremendous. And I don't even dare talk to them about Hamas and what they feel about it at this moment. But in the West Bank, what we clearly say, we haven't done a survey, I must, of course, admit, but it clearly, we see a significant rise in the popularity of Hamas. There is a spike that we have never seen, something similar to it. So under current conditions, we will continue to see greater support for Hamas in the West Bank, and I don't know about Gaza. This will dissipate soon after the war ends and people start looking objectively into what had been going on and so on, and how much Hamas has been able to deliver to the Palestinians. The support will decline. We've seen this after every single war. This is the fifth war that Hamas has engaged in with Israel. And after each one of those wars, we saw a spike in Hamas's popularity. 3 months later, we begin to see this rise in popularity leveling back to where it was before, or even sometimes less. So we should expect Palestinians in this case to do the same. The impact of the atrocities is not going to be felt at this point. And if it is, it will only be felt by those who are able. And I must tell you, the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians at this point will not be able to look objectively at what has been happening and will be in total denial until the guns are quiet.
Yeah. When analysts say that Hamas is the organizational embodiment of an idea, I mean, they say this about the PLO. The PLO is the organizational embodiment of an idea. That idea, in a general sense, is Palestinian nationalism with a discrete claim to a specific piece of territory. When they say that Hamas is the embodiment of an idea, what are they really talking about? Is it the religiosity and the Islamist commitment in that religiosity, or is it something more?
There are two elements to Hamas's political ideology. Hamas's social ideology is very clear. It is about religiosity. It is about Islam, the basic principles of Islam. But politically, this is about a state that Hamas aspires to create that is governed by religious rules. And it is about relations with Israel, where the Palestinians do not recognize the legitimacy of the state of Israel. Hamas has indicated that it is willing to make de facto peace with Israel, but it's not willing to make de jure peace with Israel. Hamas's original position some 50 years ago are positions that is the Muslim Brothers, and Hamas is an offshoot of that, is to essentially deny that Israel has any kind of legitimacy, that it does not have the right to exist as a state. Nonetheless, over time, Hamas has come to accept the reality that that Israel exists, and that there is a need to reach some kind of accommodation with Israel, including the creation of a Palestinian state alongside the state of Israel. What Hamas hasn't done is what the PLO had done. The PLO had moved from that position that is the claim to the entire Palestine, to accept the notion of a two-state solution, while the vast majority of Hamas supporters who share its value system also endorse this idea of refusing legitimacy for Israel. Some do. We do find some people within Hamas who support Hamas, and even among Hamas elite and leaders, who are willing to entertain the idea of not just a long-term truce or hudna with Israel, but also recognition of the legitimacy of the state of Israel in a context of a two-state solution. There has been a widening process within Hamas over the last 30 years, and certainly since 2006, when Hamas won the elections and came under tremendous pressure to recognize Israel. There has been a lot of debate within Hamas. It has not reached the point where Hamas is willing to do that, but it did leave an impact on the mindset and the discourse, but it does still remain decidedly against de jure recognition of Israel's legitimacy.
Let's talk a little bit. You have a fascinating breakdown of how we got to this point, October 7, 2023. Could you briefly describe the phases that you think led Hamas to this decision point to launch this attack last month?
I think it was very clear to Hamas immediately after it took over control over Gaza in 2007 that it is in a very serious predicament, and it does not have a strategy out of this difficulty, and it was searching for alternative, what to do. No one was recognizing it, and I think it went through these three phases, as you said. The first phase is the one where Hamas sought to create a mini-state in Gaza, with Egypt being the exit to the rest of the world. This strategy was relatively successful as long as Egypt tolerated the hundreds of tunnels that operated underneath the border. That gave Hamas a political economy that seemed to be fine, and Hamas was making a lot of money based on that and running the Gaza Strip, not very successfully, but it was managing. And when Morsi became president, in fact, this idea seemed to have finally gained momentum within Hamas. Sisi killed this idea, and with the killing of this idea, a new leadership also emerged within Hamas, by the way, at that time. We're now talking about the period 14 all the way to 21, when we see Hamas essentially reconsidering the idea of a mini-state and showing willingness to reintegrate into the Palestinian formal political process, and Sinwar in particular beginning to lead this and showing tremendous willingness to compromise with the PA.
That's Egypt. Yahya Sinwar,
the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And there is no doubt that he was very popular, remains very popular in Hamas's circles. And he thought that if Abbas agrees to holding of elections, Hamas participating, Hamas could reintegrate itself, and one Palestinian Authority could again control the West Bank and Gaza. The only thing he would not give up, of course, was the militia, the armed wing of Hamas.
Right. So
that strategy failed.
Let me just stop here for a sec. So 2007 to 2013 was the Egyptian strategy.
Yes, that's the exit.
Right. Sisi kills that, yes, with Morsi now gone. And we enter the 2013-14 period, which brings us up to what? May 2021, the cancellation of elections.
Right, April 21, cancellation of elections.
With Abbas.
That by 21, we have again Sinwar essentially making all the decisions on behalf of Hamas. And this was basically his gamble. He is gambling with Abbas, holding elections, reunifying the West Bank and Gaza. This is a new strategy for Hamas, and it fails when in April Abbas cancels the elections. Sinwar essentially is out of options. He launches the war in May 21. In response to that, uses whatever was happening in Jerusalem at that point in order to justify what he did. But that, in fact, that war was mainly against Abbas rather than against Israel.
Right.
There is no doubt that in the aftermath, Israel started to look at Gaza with new eyes. And we had a new government in Israel around the end of 21. the Lapid-Bennett government that existed for more than a year was willing to reach out to Hamas to reach some sort of accommodation. This was a continuation of the accommodation that Netanyahu originally sought when he became prime minister in 2009 with Hamas, starting with the deal to release prisoners for the release of Gilad Shalit, the soldier who was in Hamas's hands. Now, the idea that there is a third idea that comes to Hamas as an exit. The exit is now through Israel. The Israel strategy is that Hamas and Israel will make a deal, a long-term truce, maybe 20 years, maybe 25 years, who knows, but it would give Gaza an exit to the rest of the world through a port, perhaps in Cyprus, and opening the borders with Israel, both with Israel and Egypt. The prisoners exchange, however, was absolutely critical for that idea to succeed, to have legitimacy in the West Bank, because the West Bank would certainly have been opposed to the idea that Gaza would have its own mini state, and the prisoners exchange that Sinwar wanted was one that would release at least 1,000, if not more, for the two bodies that he had and the two men who he had. And Israel was not willing to give him that. And I think the offensive that Sinwar launched, therefore, on October 7 was mainly focused on sending a shock to the Israeli political system and provide him with the necessary leverage to have a much wider exchange of prisoners and a much greater deal, a more comprehensive deal that would give Sinwar and Hamas this mini-state in Gaza in an agreement with Israel. That's the third strategy that have failed miserably on October 7, because to a large extent, I think Sinwar did not estimate the kind of success that he would end up. He did not estimate the kind of brutality that his men would be committing. And he certainly did not prepare them for this kind of war. These are members of an organization that have never been in such a war, and they have no idea what international law says. And certainly that was the Achilles heel, I think, for this third exit for Hamas.
The brutality and the savagery was not, in your view, intentional?
Part of it was intentional. There is no doubt that there was a need for a shock, and there was a need to send to the Palestinians images that will tell them that what Israel has been doing to Gaza has now been responded to, that Hamas has led, that Hamas had taken the necessary revenge. So brutality was meant. It was. I can't speak of any particular kind of brutality, but there is no doubt that these men were ordered to commit atrocities, deliberately commit atrocities, and that there is absolutely no doubt that this was not an accident or that these men acted on their own. However, the extent to which this was done and the gruesome scenes that we have seen, one cannot exactly know what kind of orders were given, but it goes beyond doubt that the brutality was indeed part and parcel of the plan that Sinwar had prepared for Israel.
And the taking of hostages designed to trade and or possibly constrain what Sinwar, who had spent enough time in Israeli prisons to understand probably what the reaction of Israeli society and the Israeli government and Israeli military would be to the events of October 7, was done probably to constrain Israeli military options in Gaza. Do you think that was part of the calculation here?
I think he wanted as many prisoners as possible, and that to give him the kind of leverage that he needed. The prisoners exchange is absolutely critical for the strategy, for the success of the strategy of building a mini state in Gaza. Without it, there is no legitimacy, and he needed that. How successful he would be, of course, there was absolutely no way he would know. And nobody would have, in our wildest imagination, would have thought that there would be no resistance, that these men would simply walk in and commit all these atrocities and take all these hostages. That is something I don't think Sinwar counted on. He wanted some, he threw in thousands of people to achieve the job, perhaps thinking that a few hundred of them would succeed, or even a few dozens of them would succeed and would get him what he needed to be able to negotiate from a point of strength to release prisoners and to reach accommodation with Israel. He needed a limited war with Israel that gives him the capacity to then engage in serious negotiations that would give him this comprehensive deal that puts Hamas comfortably in control of the Gaza Strip for a long time to come.
It may prove to be a strategic miscalculation of historic proportion, if in fact what you're saying is that Sinwar believed somehow that his leverage could be translated into some sort of negotiated arrangement with the Israelis, the return of prisoners, which would boost Hamas's stock on the Palestinian street and turn it into the most successful element of the Palestinian national movement. I suspect it's not going to turn out that way, but you have phenomenally, stunningly fascinating views on what the post-conflict environment might look like. And I realize we're speculating, we're guessing, we're trying to divine in the middle of a war what the outcome and entity would be. But there are all kinds of ideas bouncing around in the heads of very smart people in this town about what is possible in a post-conflict Gaza. Without prejudging my own views about this, give us your best sense of what won't work. Assuming, and Khalil, you'll have to help me here. I don't know what the assumption on which we're basing, that Hamas is destroyed as a military organization, perhaps an administrative structure, but the idea that it represents, its embedding in the fabric of Palestinian society, the social aspects, the religiosity, survives. But what, in your judgment, based on what you know, and what may or may not be acceptable to Gazans and West Bankers, what won't work?
Well, Hamas is an organization beyond the military. So it is an idea, absolutely, but it's also a social organization, a service delivery organization, and of course, a military organization. You can destroy the military organization. The capacity of Israel, however, to destroy the other organizations is extremely limited. And to destroy the military capacity of Hamas, to prevent Hamas from controlling Gaza, setting the rules for Gaza, Israel will have to reoccupy the entire Gaza Strip. But the minute Israel reoccupies the entire Gaza Strip, in my view, it will have little choice but to stay there, at least for some time to come, maybe for a long time to come. We don't know, because it will be very difficult for it to withdraw and leaving Gaza, back to Hamas. That is going to happen if and when Israel decides to leave without making a deal, a second Israeli unilateral withdrawal from Gaza after it reoccupies the entire Gaza Strip to achieve its declared goals, will mean that Hamas will return. No one else is interested in controlling Gaza. This should be absolutely clear. Not the Palestinian Authority, not the international community, not the Arab countries. None of these actors will be interested in controlling Gaza. If Israel does not want to control Gaza, it will have to decide whether it's willing to pay the price for somebody else to control Gaza. The only other party that might be able to control Gaza, if the price is right, is going to be the Palestinian Authority. The other actors, all of them combined, will be willing to deliver services, humanitarian and otherwise. They will not be willing to police Gaza, I believe, or set the rules for Gaza, that is, govern Gaza. Only the Palestinian Authority will be able to do that, and only the Palestinian Authority will have the legitimacy to do that if Israel meets its conditions. And these conditions will be to essentially have a resumption of the peace process under certain conditions, in which there will be, at the end of this process, a creation of a Palestinian state in which the West Bank and Gaza are one territorial unit. This is what Israel has been trying to avoid for the last 15 years. This is why the Israeli government been making deals with Hamas, consolidating Hamas's control over Gaza. And now Israel will find itself in total reoccupation of Gaza, but having to consider whether it should or should not leave. And the only alternative to it, in my view, will be the Palestinian Authority, but the price is going to be too prohibitive, and the alternative will be to leave without it, and that means giving it back to Hamas.
Right. So, I mean, this to me is the most stunning conclusion of all. The logic chain seems compelling. You destroy Hamas's military capacity and its administrative and sovereignty in Gaza. But the Israelis, that mandates an Israeli reoccupation for let's argue, for a discrete period of time, 2, 3, 4 months. Let's assume there's a buffer zone even set up. Although with rocket trajectories, I'm not sure how effective that would be. What you're saying is, and this is where the fantasies, if they are fantasies, bouncing around in the heads of policymakers. And I don't mean to be critical, but it's an incredibly important point. What you're arguing is that Arab states, Egyptians, Jordanians, Saudis, even if they're gendarmerie rather than military forces, will not, cannot engage in counterinsurgency against Palestinians in Gaza. They cannot secure Gaza, maintain law and order, because of the absence of legitimacy, and without a regional mechanism. Forget UN trusteeship a la Kosovo and the creation of a multinational force to patrol Gaza. Forget American forces into Gaza. It really opens the door, if you're correct, it opens the door to a kind of return with a lot of death and destruction to boot to October 6th of this year.
Yes, no one is going to want to get into Gaza without knowing the end game. What is the end game? The Egyptians or the Saudis or the Jordanians or the Palestinian Authority and the PLO? The question will be, what is the end game here?
Right.
Where are we heading, and what is the price? And without this being spelled out, and right now I can't see Israel willingness to spell out this end game, and I don't see the U.S. showing any kind of leadership in helping to spell out this end game.
Well, yeah, humor me for a minute. The President of the United States several days ago made a statement that is really rather extraordinary. Flat out statement. And the New York Times reported he conveyed it to Netanyahu as well, which was simply this: we cannot go back to the status quo as it existed on October 6th. Now, that is a head exploding thought for any administration. Because what essentially what you're saying is there is a PA option. There may actually be an Arab state option, kind of, with respect to security and funding and resourcing, but only if it's tethered to not just a talking point about a two-state solution, but an ambitious effort to put Israelis and Palestinians on a pathway to resolve Jerusalem, borders, security, refugees, and ending all conflicts and claims. In the wake of two traumatized societies, Israel will go through its political reckoning. It may not just be a question of a year or so Following 73, Meir was forced to resign in April, but it took 3 more years until Likud in 1977, in the real earthquake, basically presented itself as the dominant force, with some exceptions, for the next 30 years. And Palestinian reckoning, with Abbas now in the 18th year of a 4-year term, is even going to be messier. So aren't we left? We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more observations on your part. Aren't we left really at sea here? The post-conflict Gaza must be tethered to a serious effort to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the wake of 2 societies which will be traumatized, in no mood to compromise. Certainly on the Israeli side, that's the case. And with a Biden administration entering 2024, perhaps at the worst possible time to put its arms around this whole enterprise and do what no administration has been willing or able to do for the last 30 years, since there's been a peace process.
And at a time, I would further add, on the Palestinian side, this is one of the worst moments in terms of willingness to compromise as well. The hardening of attitudes and militancy among Palestinians in the West Bank is unprecedented. We are back to the days of the Second Intifada in terms of attitudes, and worse in terms of hardening of attitudes regarding peace. So this is why I say, if the Israelis, as it seems likely, reoccupy Gaza, they will most likely be staying there for a long time to come, because of the lack of better options, alternatives, as they see it. And in my view, if they decide at the end of the day that they can't pay the price in what we are now talking about, which is ending the conflict, a 2-state solution, along the lines of what they have been trying to avoid so for all these years, the alternative is for them to go back to Hamas, make a deal of a long-term truce that Sinwar has always wanted, and once again see ourselves in this dance where we are absolutely where the October 7 events would still be something that we would have to consider happening at some other point in the future. Israelis and Palestinians will have to make a decision. They are not right now ready to make it. Is the U.S. ready to help them make it? Is the region ready to help them make it? That is the question. I'm afraid I don't see the U.S. or the region showing that kind of leadership yet. And if that is the case, then the Israelis are on their own. They put themselves in Gaza, they will find it extremely difficult to get themselves out of Gaza.
You identified the core issue here, the core word, leadership. That is what is going to be, but leadership of a heroic capacity. I mean, the decisions that need to be taken by Israelis, Palestinians, and assuming Americans are mediators, are just, I mean, I was depressed before this conversation. The analysis, but I must say, Khalil, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the analysis, the scenario you paint is one that has to be seriously considered in any day after planning exercise that is being done by any number of think tanks and any number of governments, including my government. And I think, again, I can't thank you enough for what you've done. There's a clarity here and a logic chain that really needs to be carefully unpacked by all of us. And it's probably not too early to begin to come to terms with that. So Khalil Shikaki, I want to thank you for your friendship, for your willingness to appear, and for the work that you do. Literally, I think on behalf of all of us.
Thank you, Aaron. A pleasure to be with you.
Take care and be well.
You too. Thank you.